Hey, welcome back. We're going to talk today about the refills, the various refills for the Copics and the nibs and some do's and don'ts and some little tips and tricks. So you're going to get hopefully a little bit of everything you need to know about refilling your markers. First thing I get asked a lot is, how do you tell when your marker needs to be refilled? The first thing is, if you're not getting really good blends, you might want to check your marker. If you see a little white on your marker, on the tips, when you're coloring, it means that the ink isn't flowing back into the tip fast enough to get a nice juicy blend. If that's happening, what I like to do is I turn the marker over to the chisel side and I look to see if there's little white streaks in it. If there is, then I automatically know that I need to refill it at that point. Just to verify though, I like to draw on a piece of paper like that. If you see that the lines aren't consistent, that's another sign that you need to change out the nibs. So, if that happens and I'm out coloring, let's say at a group playtime with my friends or whatever, I bring little rubber bands and I just go ahead and put the rubber band on it, put it back in my case, and when I get home I know that that's the one that I need to refill. Highly recommend that you buy refills for the markers that you use the most. And when just getting started, if you own, let's say, all the Copic markers, then the best thing to do is to start with the lighter colors first. So if you have a blend of 3, you'd choose your lightest and your medium marker to get those various refills to keep on hand. Nothing worse than running out of ink when you need that marker the most. So Copic has a couple tools that I'd like to talk about for refilling. For one, some people don't know what a tip looks like, and that one wants to roll. This would be your brush tip. This one right here would be your medium broad tip. So they call this one the super brush and this one the medium broad. Those are 2 of the 3 tips that you can get for the sketch and the chow marker. If you look at the brush tip, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a line right here, and it's actually a separate piece adhered, and I have one that I've taken apart that I'll come across at some point and show you, but it actually can separate, and you don't want that to happen. So when refilling, we try to avoid taking this tip out of the marker unless it's time to replace it. If you go to pull that out of the marker and you're not ready to replace it, there's a good chance that you'll separate it and then it'll render it useless, and then you're stuck with having to replace it. So always have extra nibs on hand in that event. They have a couple tools for pulling the tips. They're little tweezers. Sometimes I use them, it's usually if it's within reach, but most times I'll use my hand. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and pull off the tip, the medium broad, and I'm just going to use my fingers. Simple as that. Okay? Then I'm going to get my various ink refill, and unlike the lids that pull off, this refill actually twists off. When twisting it off, you don't want to squeeze the bottle. If you have a brand new one, there's a good chance that it's going to overflow and squirt out as you're untwisting that. The way I like to do it is I just hold it and I count. So get a steady hand on this one. I rest my finger here so that when I'm aiming and counting, I'm dropping it down the barrel. So you don't want to do this over your project you're working on. You don't want to do it over your dog, your carpet. It can be kind of messy. When you're pulling out the tip, I prefer to use my fingers as you can see. But just remember, if you're refilling a yellow and a blue, you might want to do the yellow first before you do the blue, or you're going to end up with blue ink on your yellow. Also, don't pull those out with your teeth unless you're prepared to have a colored tongue. So all I do is count the drops. If my sketch marker is completely empty, then I'm going to go ahead and start with about 40 drops. I've gone up to 60, 70 drops depending on how empty it is. If you're afraid of overfilling it, then remove the cap off the brush tip. And if the ink starts dripping out, you know it's probably time to stop. So I'm going to go ahead and just continue to put some more drops in here by counting. When you're finished, go ahead and take your tip and you put it back in. Now, I like to point out there's a little picture right here, and that shows the end that the medium broad tip will go into. Also, I like to follow the rule of the direction that it's facing. And there's a reason for that. So I'm going to go ahead and just push that in, and it mimics that same direction. I've showed this once before, but this is what the inside of a marker looks like. It has a wrapped piece of foam product, and it's kind of smushy. And if you look at the end, and I don't know if you can see it very well, there's an indentation. You want the tips, when they go in, to sit inside that indentation so that it gets a good wicking action going. If your tip is a little bit out, then it's not going to be filling up. Same thing applies for the brush tip. Now that brings up another thing. Some people are having a hard time with their blend and they're going, I know I filled it up, I don't understand what's going on, but the ink doesn't seem to be flowing correctly. Well, sometimes when you receive your marker or when you put a new tip in there, do you see the difference in length? This one has not been put in or seated properly within the barrel. All you have to do, use your fingers and gently push it back in. Now the ink should flow a lot more smooth onto the brush tip. And yes, I'm making a mess. Okay, so once that's done, if you have a new tip, you'll actually visually see the ink flowing into it. A couple of other ways. Some people don't feel like they have a steady enough hand to drip it inside the hole. So you can actually drip it onto the tip and count your drops that way. It'll take a little longer because you want to wait between dripping it on the tip to visually see it going inside the barrel. So as you can see, that'll take a little bit longer, but it is just as efficient. Another way, for those that don't like getting their hands dirty, is to use the needle. Now the needle goes on the end of the various refill and you just screw it down onto it. Now this is the broad, this is still the broad end, and there's a little gap right here in between it. All you do is slip that in the side, and then you squeeze a particular amount of cc's into the barrel just by squeezing. When you're done, you pull it out. So if you'll notice with this blue refill, you can't actually see how much is in it. So squeezing it by cc's, which are measured on the side, are going to be a little bit more difficult to visually see how much you're putting in there. That's why I prefer the other methods. When you're done, you're going to go ahead and unscrew it, and then you're going to make sure you clean this out. You can use a colorless blender solution to clean it, or you can use rubbing alcohol, but clean it out before you put it away. And when you're done refilling, you don't want to use this cap because that won't work very well. See how easy that is to do? just screw that one back on, and that's done. Now a couple other things to remember, and I'm like really bad at this, and I'll show you. The inside of the cap. I just got some alcohol swabs, and I use tweezers to clean out the inside. You want to try to keep it as clean as possible so that when you put the lid on, it gets good contact and a good seal. If not, the alcohol will evaporate out of the pigment and make it thicker. So clean it as often as you can. And again, I'm probably the very worst at that, and I'm okay with them being a little bit sticky, but it makes the lids harder to get off. When you are uncapping it and it's very sticky inside, the best thing to do is to slightly twist and pull when coloring. It's a lot easier than yanking it and having it splatter all over your project. Like I mentioned before, I don't know if you know, but this gray line means that is the brush end, and that's the end that most people will be coloring with. So another thing I wanted to point out is the Copic chows. The Copic chows have an end for the broad that has a little seal inside, that little ring. This makes it a child safety cap, so if a child swallows it, the air holes on the other side will allow the air to still travel even though it's stuck in the child's throat, so that you can get it removed. But in order to make it a totally 100% airtight, they had to make it with that little rim inside. That can cause a problem if you're coloring in a hurry and you accidentally uncap the wrong end, and then you go to put it in and it hits that little edge. And what happens when it hits that edge, if you do it repeatedly, and this one's to an extreme, this one's really bad, but it starts to split it. When that happens, then you need to replace it. So if you're loaning them out to your friends, make sure they're aware of that on the chow markers. You don't want them to get it back and have a little bunny tail at the end of your marker. So keep your markers clean. That'll give a better seal for the lids. Make sure you don't refill over your carpet. Now you know the right tools to use to refill, and it's quite easy. And at the very end of this video, I'll put approximately how many drops I recommend that you start with. And then after those numbers, you need to kind of just watch the end to see if it's starting to drip out. One thing to remember when you're refilling a marker is don't be afraid. Worst case scenario is you end up overfilling it, and we'll learn later how to fix that. Start with a lighter color. That way, if you do make a mess, it's not as bad, and just go for it. So what do we do if we overfill a marker? The best thing to do is just get a piece of paper or a paper towel and just go ahead and scribble some of that ink out until it's not dropping ink anymore onto the paper. Another thing to keep an eye out if you think you've overfilled it is if this tip starts getting really, really glossy and shiny, there's a good chance that the ink's just getting ready to spit all over your paper. So keep that in mind when you're coloring. You see this starting to get shine. You might want to move off to the side and check on the tip to make sure it's not going to, as I say, throw up on your project. I also want to mention that if you're pulling out the brush tip because you're ready to replace it, or you feel you need to clean it, but you have one as an extra one as a spare just in case you ruin the nib, make sure you use something similar to the tweezers, and you want to go all the way down on the shaft of that brush, squeeze and pull. If you do it up here on the brush when you pull, there's a good chance that this is going to separate. Would you like to see what one looks like when it separates? I'll show you. So that is the inside of this brush. That's what you don't want to have break down, because then the tip will get soft. So if you're pulling it in the wrong area, you're most likely to pull that out and not the whole tip. So keep that in mind when you're doing it. You want to use the right tool for it, because if you do it with your fingers, there's a good chance that it will tear it apart. Let's talk a little bit about refilling a wide marker. There's only one side to actually refill. On the wide marker, there's a little indentation. And all you do is drop it in that indentation. It's pretty simple. When you're done, recap it, and you're good to go. When refilling your colorless blender marker, make sure you use the Copic Various Inks that is made for the colorless blender. You don't want to use water or anybody else's product, because you're not going to have the results that you want. So make sure that you purchase a refill that is made for the colorless blender. I hope you enjoyed the tips and tricks today that you've learned, and feel free if you have any questions to leave them in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you back soon.